Jack was a blacksmith, and he worked out of an outbuilding on the edge of his father's farm. Now Jack's mother had long passed away, and when his father eventually passed, well, Jack had no interest in running a farm, so he sold off the land. But Jack did with the money the same as he did with everything he had. He drank it. With the father and mother gone, Jack had no one, and that seemed to suit him. Jack just spent his days at the forge, and then as soon as it got dark, he made his way down to the pub where he drank and he drank. But Jack had a nickname. Jack wasn't one for having people haggle with him. Jack's nickname was Stingy Jack. People used to say that if you turned your back on him, he'd down your pint. And to be honest, they weren't wrong. When Jack's money started running out, he'd drink what he could. He was stealing glasses from tables. And his work started to dry up as well, because the more Jack drank, the worse his work became. And rumours spread that Jack's handiwork led to a lot of deaths. Wheels coming off carriages, rafters falling from ceilings because the bolts just didn't hold. But either way, the work dried up. And still, Jack drank. Every night to the pub, and when closing came, he'd leave the pub, put his coat up around his neck to keep the cold out. And as he walked home, he used to jump a wall into a neighbour's farm, pluck a turnip from the ground and eat that on the way home, rather than spend money on food. Well, you see, one night Jack was in the tavern. He was sitting down, nursing a drink, which had sitting in front of him for hours, it seemed, when all of a sudden a stranger came into the bar. This tall, handsome, sharp stranger, dressed all in black, a long black coat and piercing black eyes. Jack didn't pay much attention to him, but Jack noticed that no one in the bar seemed to be aware of him. Now, Jack was used to being ignored himself. No one had a good word for him, or a bad word even, but a stranger like this coming in and no one's head even turned, Jack was surprised. He was even more surprised when the stranger sat down across him at the table. But Jack didn't look up. He just continued to sup. But the most surprising thing happened next. "Jack. How's your evening, Jack?" said the stranger. Well, Jack looked up. He just mumbled something at him and went back to his drink. And the stranger continued to try and make small talk with Jack, but Jack just ignored him. In the same way everyone in the bar seemed to be ignoring the two men. And when time came and last orders came, Jack finally spoke. He said to the stranger, he says, "You think I don't know who you are? You don't think I'd recognize the devil with all my years on this earth? I know who you are, and I know why you're here. What do you want with my soul? I'm a wretched creature, and I have no value." "Jack," said the stranger, "every soul has a value, and yes, your time has come. You'll pass tonight, and your soul is mine." Well, Jack said, "If my soul is yours anyway," he says, "you wouldn't do us a last favour." He says, "Last orders have just been called, and I've no money left." He says, you wouldn't stand as a drink, would you?" The devil smiled. But the devil was like, "Jack, I've come out without a stitch on me, without a penny on me. I've no purse. I can't possibly buy you a drink." "You're the devil," says Jack. He says, "you could turn yourself into a sixpence," he says, "and I could buy myself a drink," he says, "and you'd be free. My soul would be yours." Jack took the last sip out of his glass, and when he looked up, the stranger was gone. But sitting on the table in front of him was a coin. Now, Jack could have spent that coin and bought himself a good measure, but he didn't. Jack did something very strange. He spat on his thumb and he pinned the coin to the table, and he whispered. He says, "You'll not have my soul this night." And he says, "I want you to promise me that you'll give me 1 more year, or so help me God, I will keep my thumb and pressing you down until my soul leaves my body. Well, the coin started to heat up and Jack could hear the hiss, but the devil agreed. Jack took the coin, left the pub, and he turned and he flung the coin as hard as he could away from the direction that Jack lived. Jack turned on his heels and ran, and as he ran, he could hear laughing in the distance. Well, knowing that the devil would be a man of his word, Jack slowed his pace and he continued his way home. When he came to his neighbour's field, he jumped the wall, plucked a turnip from the ground as he did every night, and he ate it as he made his way home and fell asleep in his chair. Now, the next morning, you think after something like that you'd change your ways, but Jack was a creature of habit. And for the next year, Jack continued on as he had done before. And one night, as he sat in the pub, supping away, in walked a stranger. A year had passed and the stranger hadn't aged a day. Still no one looked at him. But before he could even sit at the table, Jack stood up, gave the devil a smile, pulled on his coat, and he says, "Well, I guess it's time for us to go." The devil was surprised that he was being so accommodating as the two men left the pub and strolled down the road. Jack was a bit more chatty. He told the devil all about his life as if the devil didn't already know. But he says, listen, he says, every time I walk down this road at night, he says, I jump this field, jump the wall into the field, and I pull a turnip from the ground and I eat. And I'll be honest, it's miserable. I don't even particularly like turnips. But he says, in that field across there, he says, there's an apple tree. And on that tree grow the sweetest, most delicious apples in any land. But I'm too old and I'm too broken to climb the tree and pick an apple, so wouldn't be too much to ask one last favour. The devil laughed at this. He couldn't believe Jack was asking for something else again. He says, listen, Jack, he says, listen, just go and pick me an apple, like a last supper. He says, you wouldn't deny me one last pleasure. So the two men hopped the wall, walked across to the tree. The devil looked up and he could see, sure enough, a beautiful, polished, sweet apple on a high branch. He looked at Jack and then he climbed the tree. It was nothing to him. He was up the tree like a flash. But as quickly as he climbed that tree, Jack pulled a small pocket knife out of his jacket and he carved a cross into the tree. And the devil felt it straight away. He turned and he hissed and he snarled at Jack, and Jack just laughed. Jack says, I could leave you up there. He says, with this cross, there's no way you can come down. But I'll make you one more deal, he says. I want you to promise me that there'll never be a place in hell for my soul. And if you throw me down an apple and make me that promise, I'll scratch out the cross and you're free to go. Well, reluctantly, the hissing devil agreed. He threw the apple at Jack's head. Jack took the apple. And he took the little knife and he scratched out the cross on the tree. And the devil jumped down, nose to nose with Jack. The devil just smiled. Jack turned and was back to the devil. He walked away. Well, he didn't look back and he didn't change his ways. But Jack didn't even have another year. Later on that winter, Jack passed away, sitting in his chair, turnip in hand. His soul left his body and ascended to the heavens. Jack arrived at the pearly gates. Well, he was told there was no place in heaven for him. With how he'd lived his life and all that he'd done, there was no way he could be let in. And the realization struck Jack. He knew he'd been bad, but surely there'd be forgiveness. Suddenly Jack felt the ground just disappear beneath his feet. And Jack fell and he fell and he fell, the cold air against his back as he rushed down and down. And the cold air turned to heat and redness around him as Jack hit the ground, he hadn't landed on Earth. He was in the land of his old friend. When Jack stood up and brushed himself off, his gaze was met by the friendly, piercing black eyes of the devil. "Jack, you're paying me a visit," said the devil. Jack dusted himself off and said, "Okay, fair enough," he says, "but I bested you twice. But I suppose now it's time. In we go." Well, the devil said, No, he says, "Jack, I made you a promise. I promised that there would never be a place for you here." And he just smiled. Jack started to panic when he realised that, well, if he couldn't be in heaven and he wasn't welcome in hell, where was he to go? He looked at the devil and he said, "What am I to do? Where am I meant to go? Where do I belong?" The devil said, "You belong nowhere. You're cursed now to walk a dark and cold earth for all time." Jack panicked. He says, "Well, how will I see? How will I find my way?" And the devil, taking pity on Jack one last time, plucked an ember from the ground, from the floor of hell, and flicked it at Jack. Jack scrabbled and took the ember, and he pushed it inside the turnip that he held in his hand, and he took that light and he made his way back, and he wandered, never stopping anywhere, never finding anywhere to call home. He wandered the earth as he still does to this day. And that's the terrible legend of Stingy Jack.